She pointed at my cabin and screamed that I had exactly 12 hours to tear it down or she'd have it bulldozed herself. Victoria Pemberton, the HOA president of Willowbrook Estates, stood on my porch at 6 in the morning with a demolition order she'd typed up on her home computer, claiming my grandfather's hunting cabin violated 17 different community standards. What she didn't know was that I'd been recording every threat, every illegal trespass, and every attempt at extortion for the past 3 months, and in exactly 4 hours, her entire kingdom of suburban tyranny would come crashing down when I played her confession over the community's PA system during the annual homeowners meeting. The nightmare had started 3 months earlier when I'd inherited the 10-acre property from my grandfather, Earl Hayes. The land sat at the edge of Willowbrook Estates, technically within the expanded boundaries they'd drawn up 5 years ago. Though Grandpa Earl had owned it since 1952, long before the first McMansion sprouted from what used to be farmland. I'm Mason Hayes, 34 years old, and I'd been living in Seattle working as a software engineer when the lawyer called to tell me about the inheritance. Grandpa's health had been declining for years, and he'd spent his final months in a care facility, but he'd never sold the property despite numerous offers from developers and the HOA. The cabin wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a simple log structure with a metal roof and a wraparound porch. But it held 60 years of memories and was built with Grandpa's own hands. When I'd arrived to assess the property, I'd found it in better condition than expected. The caretaker Grandpa had hired did excellent work, maintaining it, and structurally it was sound as the day it was built. I'd decided to take a sabbatical from work and spend some time fixing it up, maybe figuring out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life while I was at it. That's when I'd met Victoria Pemberton for the first time. She'd arrived in a white Escalade with HOA magnetic signs on the doors, dressed in a coral blazer and pressed slacks like she was heading to a board meeting instead of trudging through the woods. Her bottle blonde hair was styled in that aggressive bob that seemed mandatory for HOA presidents, and her smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. She'd introduced herself as the president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association and handed me a thick packet of documents. "Welcome to the community," she'd said in a voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm sure you'll want to review our covenants and architectural guidelines before you do any work on the property. We have very high standards here at Willowbrook, and that cabin is going to need extensive modifications to come into compliance." I'd flipped through the packet, noting requirements for minimum square footage, approved exterior colors, landscaping standards, and architectural styles. Nothing in their guidelines would allow for a 60-year-old log cabin. "This cabin predates your HOA by several decades," I'd told her calmly. "It's grandfathered in under state law." Her smile had tightened imperceptibly. "That's a common misconception. When we expanded our boundaries, all properties within those boundaries became subject to our covenants. You'll find it's all quite legal. I suggest you consult with our approved architects about bringing the structure into compliance or consider demolishing it and building something more appropriate for the neighborhood." She'd left me with the packet and a business card for her preferred architect, who I later discovered was her brother-in-law. I'd spent the next week researching property law and HOA regulations, confirming what I'd already suspected. The cabin was indeed grandfathered in, and no HOA formed after a structure was built could force its demolition or significant modification. Armed with this knowledge, I'd sent Victoria a polite letter explaining the legal situation and expressing my intention to maintain the cabin as it was. That's when the harassment began in earnest. First came the violation notices, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single day. My grass was a 1/4 inch too high. The cabin's color wasn't on the approved list. My vehicle was parked at an unapproved angle. The rustic wooden mailbox violated community standards. Each notice came with a fine, starting at $50 and escalating to $500 for repeat violations. I responded to each one with a copy of the state law protecting pre-existing structures, but the notices kept coming. Then Victoria escalated to more creative tactics. I'd wake up to find my driveway blocked by strategically placed traffic cones, supposedly for community maintenance that never seemed to happen. The power company received anonymous complaints about illegal connections, requiring me to take time off to meet with inspectors who found nothing wrong. Building inspectors showed up claiming they'd received reports of unpermitted construction. Each time, I had to stop what I was doing and deal with the interruption. And each time the inspectors left shaking their heads at the waste of their time. 2 weeks into this campaign, I'd installed security cameras around the property. It was a decision that would prove invaluable later. The cameras captured Victoria personally removing my American flag from its pole at 2 in the morning, claiming later that it violated the HOA's flag display guidelines. They recorded her measuring my grass with a ruler at dawn, looking for any blade that exceeded the 2.5-inch maximum. Most damning, they caught her having my legally parked truck towed while I was at the grocery store, claiming it was an abandoned vehicle despite current registration tags. Getting my truck back had cost me $300, and an entire afternoon arguing with the tow company. That's when I'd decided to start recording our in-person interactions as well. I'd purchased a high-quality digital recorder and kept it running in my pocket whenever Victoria or her enforcement committee came around. The recordings revealed a pattern of escalating threats and increasingly desperate attempts to force me out. "You know, Mason," Victoria had said during one recorded conversation, "it would be so much easier if you just sold the property. I happen to know several developers who would pay well above market value for that land. You could buy a nice condo in the city with the profits." "I'm not interested in selling," I'd replied for what felt like the 100th time. "That's short-sighted of you." She'd continued, "This community has certain standards, and frankly, that cabin brings down everyone's property values. We've worked hard to create an exclusive environment here, and structures like yours simply don't fit the aesthetic we're cultivating." The aesthetic she was cultivating apparently meant cookie-cutter McMansions with identical lawns and approved mailboxes. The Willowbrook Estates HOA controlled a community of 300 homes, each worth between $800,000 and $2 million. The development featured a golf course, tennis courts, 3 pools, and a clubhouse that looked like it belonged at a country club. Monthly HOA fees ran $1,500, and Victoria ruled it all with an iron fist. What bothered me most wasn't the personal harassment, but watching how she treated other residents. I'd started attending HOA meetings to better understand what I was dealing with, and what I saw was disturbing. Victoria and her board operated like a small-town mafia, selectively enforcing rules based on who had crossed them and who stayed in line. The Korean family who'd complained about late-night noise from the clubhouse suddenly found themselves cited for their daughter's chalk drawings on the driveway. The elderly black couple who'd questioned an assessment increase received multiple fines for their garden gnome collection that had been there for 5 years without issue. At one meeting, I watched Victoria publicly humiliate a young Hispanic man who'd painted his front door a shade of blue that wasn't on the approved list. She'd made him stand while she lectured him about property values and community standards, threatening daily fines until he repainted it. The man had looked near tears, as he explained he'd already spent $3,000 on the premium paint job. But Victoria was unmoved. "Rules are rules," she'd said with that cold smile. "We can't make exceptions, or soon everyone will think they can do whatever they want." After 3 months of escalating harassment, I'd accumulated dozens of hours of recordings, hundreds of photos and videos, and a paper trail of bogus violations and fines that would make any lawyer salivate. But I was waiting for something more. Some smoking gun that would expose Victoria's true motivations beyond simple power tripping. That moment came during an encounter in my driveway when she thought we were alone. She'd arrived early one morning with yet another violation notice, this time claiming my cabin's chimney exceeded height restrictions. I'd activated my recorder before stepping outside to meet her. She'd started with her usual spiel about community standards and property values, but when I'd remained unmoved, her facade cracked. "Listen, you stubborn fool," she'd hissed, dropping all pretense of politeness. "I've been patient with you, but my patience is running out. That land you're sitting on is worth $5 million to the right developer. I've already made promises to people, important people who don't like to be disappointed. You can take the generous offer I'm about to make, or things can get very unpleasant for you." "Are you threatening me?" I'd asked, making sure to speak clearly for the recording. "I'm offering you a business opportunity," she'd replied. $2 million cash for the property. No questions asked. That's far more than it's worth with that decrepit cabin sitting on it. Take the money and disappear, or I'll make your life so miserable you'll be begging to give it away just to escape. And if I refuse? Her eyes had narrowed to slits. Then I'll use every tool at my disposal to force you out. I'll have that cabin condemned. I'll file so many liens against your property. You'll spend years in court. I'll make sure you can't get a permit to fix so much as a leaky faucet. And if that doesn't work, well, accidents happen. Old wooden structures are so prone to fires. Aren't they? There it was. The smoking gun I'd been waiting for. Threats, extortion, and implied arson, all captured in crystal clear audio. But I'd needed more. I'd needed her to incriminate herself beyond any shadow of doubt. So I'd played dumb, letting her think she was winning, while I prepared my trap. I need time to think about it. I'd told her. She'd smiled that shark smile. You have 1 week? After that, I'll assume you've chosen the hard way. And believe me, you don't want that. That week, I'd done my homework. I'd researched Victoria Pemberton thoroughly, discovering a pattern of suspicious property acquisitions around the edges of Willowbrook estates. Properties that had been in families for generations suddenly sold after the owners experienced escalating HOA harassment. The land was then quickly flipped to developers for massive profits. With Victoria's LLC getting a healthy cut of each deal, she'd been running this scam for 5 years, using her position as HOA president to force out anyone whose property could be valuable to developers. I'd also discovered that the annual homeowners meeting was coming up, the one time when all 300 households would be gathered in one place. The meeting was held in the clubhouse ballroom, complete with a professional sound system and multiple screens for presentations. It was perfect for what I had in mind. The night before the meeting, I'd made my preparations. I'd compiled all my evidence into a devastating presentation. Videos of Victoria's illegal activities, recordings of her threats and extortion attempts, documents showing the pattern of forced sales and suspicious profits. But the centerpiece would be the recording of her threatening to burn down my cabin if I didn't sell. I'd also prepared a backup plan in case Victoria tried to prevent me from speaking at the meeting. The clubhouse had an old PA system that connected to speakers throughout the facility and even to the outdoor pool area. During my reconnaissance, I discovered that the system's control room was usually locked, but the lock was a simple pin tumbler that took me less than 30 seconds to pick. I tested the system late one night, confirming I could override whatever was happening in the ballroom and broadcast to the entire facility. The morning of the meeting, Victoria had made her final move. She'd shown up at 6 a.m. with a document she claimed was a demolition order, giving me 12 hours to tear down the cabin myself, or she'd have it done for me. She'd brought 2 members of her enforcement committee as witnesses, both looking uncomfortable but too intimidated to object. "This is your last chance," she'd announced. "Demolish the cabin and sell the land, or I'll have it bulldozed and send you the bill. The county has already approved the demolition permit based on multiple safety violations." I'd examined the document, noting immediately that it was printed on HOA letterhead, not county forms. The signature at the bottom was Victoria's, not any county official's. It was a laughably transparent fake. But she was betting I'd be too intimidated to challenge it. "The annual meeting is in 4 hours. I'd observed casually. "Will you be presenting this demolition order to the homeowners?" She'd laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "The homeowners don't need to know every little detail of HOA business. This is an enforcement matter, and I have full authority to handle it as I see fit." "I see," I'd said, fingering the recorder in my pocket. "And you're certain this is legal?" "Completely legal." She'd lied with practiced ease. "My brother-in-law is a county inspector, and he's assured me everything is in order. You have 12 hours. Mr. Hayes, I suggest you start packing." As she'd turned to leave, I'd asked one more question. "What if I have evidence that you've been using your position for personal profit? What if I can prove you've been forcing people to sell their property under duress?" She'd frozen mid-step, then turned back slowly. "Then I'd say you're delusional and about to find out what happens to people who cross me. 12 hours. Mr. Hayes, don't test me." After she'd left, I'd made my final preparations. I'd loaded all my evidence onto multiple USB drives, emailed copies to my lawyer and several journalists, and prepared my presentation for the meeting. Then I'd driven to the clubhouse early, parking where I could see both the main entrance and the control room access. The annual meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., and homeowners began arriving by 9:30. I watched Victoria greeting people at the door, playing the gracious host while secretly planning to destroy my home. She had no idea that her reign of terror was about to end in the most public and humiliating way possible. At 9:45, I slipped around to the control room entrance and picked the lock again. Inside, I connected my laptop to the PA system and queued up my presentation. I had a clear view of the ballroom through a small window, allowing me to time everything perfectly. Then I waited, my heart pounding with anticipation. The meeting began promptly at 10. With Victoria taking the podium to deliver her State of the Community address, she spoke about property values, upcoming maintenance projects, and the importance of maintaining standards. The irony of her talking about standards while planning to illegally demolish my cabin wasn't lost on me. I let her speak for 15 minutes, waiting for the perfect moment. She was in the middle of discussing the budget when I made my move. I activated the PA override, and suddenly my voice filled not just the ballroom but the entire clubhouse complex. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but there's something you all need to hear. I saw Victoria's face go white as she recognized my voice. She started gesturing frantically to someone off stage, probably trying to get them to cut the sound. But I'd made sure that wouldn't be possible. I'd locked the control room door from the inside and disabled the emergency shutoff. My name is Mason Hayes, and I own the cabin property on the eastern edge of Willowbrook Estates. For the past 3 months, your HOA president, Victoria Pemberton, has been conducting a campaign of harassment and extortion to force me to sell my land. I have evidence of everything I'm about to share, and copies have been provided to law enforcement and the media. The ballroom erupted in confused murmurs. I could see Victoria pushing through the crowd, probably heading for the control room. But she wouldn't get here in time. I continued with my presentation. First, I'd like you to hear a recording from last week, where Miss Pemberton explains her true intentions regarding my property. I played the recording of her threatening me, her voice crystal clear over the PA system. The ballroom fell silent as they heard their president talking about making promises to developers, threatening to make my life miserable, and suggesting that old wooden structures were prone to fires. The implied threat of arson was unmistakable. When the recording ended, I continued, "This is not an isolated incident. Over the past 5 years, Miss Pemberton has forced out 7 property owners around the edges of Willowbrook Estates using similar tactics. Each property was sold under duress and then flipped to developers for massive profits, with Miss Pemberton's LLC receiving kickbacks totaling over $3 million. I heard pounding on the control room door. Victoria had arrived and was screaming for maintenance to break down the door, but I'd barricaded it with a heavy equipment rack, buying myself precious time. I clicked to the next part of my presentation, but it's not just about the money. It's about the abuse of power. How many of you have been selectively targeted for violations while watching others get away with the same infractions? How many have been publicly humiliated at meetings for minor issues? How many have paid thousands in fines for things that were never problems until you questioned or challenged the board? Through the window, I could see homeowners nodding and murmuring to each other. Some were pulling out phones, likely recording what was happening. Victoria's enforcement committee stood frozen on stage, clearly unsure what to do without their leader. This morning, Miss Pemberton delivered this document to my home. I displayed the fake demolition order on my laptop, which transmitted to screens throughout the facility. She claims this gives her the authority to demolish my grandfather's cabin in 12 hours. But look closely. It's printed on HOA letterhead, not county forms. It's signed by her, not a county official. It's completely fraudulent, just like her entire administration. The pounding on the door grew more frantic. I heard Victoria screaming about calling the police, which was exactly what I wanted. I'd already contacted them myself, timing it so they'd arrive right about now. Sure enough, through the window, I saw uniformed officers entering the ballroom, drawn by the commotion. The HOA board has a fiduciary duty to serve all homeowners fairly and legally. I continued, Miss Pemberton has violated that duty repeatedly for personal profit. She's committed extortion, fraud, and threatened arson. She's used her position to bully and intimidate anyone who stood in the way of her schemes. But today, I heard sirens approaching outside, multiple vehicles by the sound of it. Someone had finally found a maintenance key to the control room, and the door burst open. Victoria stormed in, her face purple with rage, followed by 2 security guards and several police officers. "Arrest him," she screamed, pointing at me. "He's trespassing. He's hijacked our meeting. He's spreading lies and slander." The lead officer, a calm professional named Sergeant Williams, looked at the scene before him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the equipment." "Of course, Sergeant," I said, raising my hands to show I pose no threat. "But first, you should know that I've documented extensive evidence of extortion, fraud, and criminal threats by Miss Pemberton. I called your department 30 minutes ago to report these crimes, and I have all the evidence right here." I handed him a USB drive I'd prepared specifically for law enforcement, containing all the recordings, videos, and documents I'd collected. There's also a recording from this morning where she delivered a fraudulent demolition order, and another where she threatens to burn down my cabin if I don't sell my property to her associates. Victoria tried to snatch the USB drive, but Sergeant Williams held it out of her reach. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down. We'll investigate all claims thoroughly." "He's lying," Victoria shrieked. "He's a troublemaker who's been violating rules for months. I have documentation of everything." "Then you won't mind if we review all the documentation from both sides," the sergeant said evenly. He turned to me. "Sir, you'll need to come with us to make a formal statement." "I understand," I said, "but first, the homeowners deserve to know one more thing." I looked directly at Victoria. This morning's demolition threat was the final straw. I've already filed complaints with the State Attorney General's office, the Fair Housing Commission, and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. The pattern of forcing property sales under duress, especially targeting elderly and minority homeowners, constitutes a federal crime. Victoria's face went from purple to white in seconds. Behind her, I could see board members backing away, trying to distance themselves from their president. Several homeowners were now openly recording the confrontation on their phones. "You can't prove anything," Victoria said, but her voice had lost its commanding tone. "Everything I've done has been legal and in the best interests of the community." "Including the meeting you had with developer Marcus Chen last Tuesday?" I asked. "The one where you promised him my land would be available within 60 days? I have that recorded too. By the way, your office has surprisingly thin walls." That was a bluff. I hadn't recorded that meeting, but Victoria didn't know that. Her reaction told everyone in the room that the meeting had indeed taken place. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, looking remarkably like a fish out of water. Sergeant Williams had heard enough. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us as well. We have some questions about these allegations." "This is ridiculous," Victoria protested. "I'm the HOA president. I have immunity for actions taken in my official capacity." "That's not how immunity works," I said helpfully, "especially not for extortion and fraud." As the police let us both out, I could hear the ballroom erupting in chaos. Homeowners were demanding answers from the remaining board members, shouting about their own experiences with Victoria's harassment, calling for immediate elections to replace the entire board. Through it all, my presentation continued to play on the screens, showing document after document of Victoria's crimes. In the parking lot, as we were being put into separate patrol cars, Victoria made one last attempt at intimidation. "You've ruined everything," she screamed at me. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The people I made promises to don't accept failure. You've put a target on both our backs. The only target on my back was the one you put there," I replied calmly. "And as for your associates, I'm sure law enforcement will be very interested in knowing who exactly you've been making promises to." As the patrol car pulled away with Victoria in the back, still screaming about lawsuits and revenge, I felt a sense of satisfaction wash over me. Grandpa Earl's cabin was safe. At least for now. The 3-month nightmare of harassment was over, and Victoria Pemberton's reign of terror had ended in the most public way possible. But I knew this was just the beginning. There would be investigations, trials, and probably attempts at retaliation from Victoria's developer friends. The HOA would need new leadership, and the community would have to heal from years of selective enforcement and bullying. As my patrol car followed Victoria's toward the police station, I could hear the faint sound of sirens growing louder, more units responding to what was sure to be a complicated investigation. The morning sun climbed higher over Willowbrook Estates, casting long shadows from the McMansions and manicured lawns. Somewhere in those shadows, my grandfather's cabin still stood, a testament to simpler times and the power of standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they thought they were. The 12-hour demolition deadline would come and go with the cabin still standing, and Victoria Pemberton would spend it in a holding cell instead of orchestrating its destruction. As we turned onto the main road, I caught a glimpse of news vans heading toward the clubhouse. By evening, the story would be everywhere. HOA, president arrested for extortion scheme. The homeowners of Willowbrook Estates would finally be free from the tyranny of selective enforcement and manufactured violations. And somewhere, I hoped Grandpa Earl was smiling, knowing his grandson had protected the cabin he'd built with his own hands from those who would destroy it for profit. The revolution at Willowbrook Estates had begun with a simple recording device and the courage to say no to a bully. Now it would end with handcuffs and headlines. Justice served with a side of public humiliation. As the patrol car headed downtown, I thought about the morning's confrontation and Victoria's threat about 12 hours to demolish my cabin. Those 12 hours were ticking away. But instead of my cabin coming down, it was her empire of intimidation that lay in ruins, broadcast live to 300 households, and soon to the world. The police station buzzed with activity as I gave my formal statement to Detective Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed investigator who specialized in white-collar crime. She'd listened to all my recordings with growing interest, occasionally pausing to take notes or ask clarifying questions. Victoria had been placed in a separate interview room, and through the thin walls, I could hear her alternating between shouting about lawsuits and demanding her lawyer, "Mr. Hayes, this is one of the most comprehensive documentation of HOA fraud I've ever seen," Detective Chen said, organizing the evidence into neat piles. The recordings alone would be enough for charges, but combined with the pattern of forced sales and the fake demolition order, we're looking at multiple felonies. She pulled up property records on her computer, cross-referencing the information I'd provided. These 7 properties that were sold after HOA harassment. They all went to the same LLC, which then flipped them to Chen Development within months. Each sale netted massive profits, and there are suspicious transfers to Victoria Pemberton's personal accounts shortly after each transaction. How long has she been doing this? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Based on these patterns, at least 6 years. She started small, targeting properties that were already for sale and steering them toward her preferred buyers. But in the last 3 years, she got bolder, actively forcing people out. The detective pulled up a map showing the properties in question. All of them border the original Willowbrook Estates boundary. She was essentially expanding the development's footprint by forcing out longtime residents. A knock on the door interrupted us. Sergeant Williams entered with a grim expression. "Detective, you need to hear this. Pemberton just implicated herself further. She's demanding we arrest Marcus Chen for blackmail. Claims he's been forcing her to deliver properties or he'd expose some previous illegal deal." Detective Chen's eyes lit up. "She's turning on her co-conspirators already? That was fast." "She's panicking," Williams explained. "Apparently, Chen called her this morning, demanding to know why Hayes wasn't cooperating. When she told him about the 12-hour ultimatum, he threatened to cut her out of their arrangement entirely. She's trying to paint herself as a victim now." I almost laughed at the irony. Victoria, who'd spent months making my life miserable, was now claiming to be the victim of the very developers she'd been conspiring with. But Detective Chen wasn't buying it. Coercion or not, she still committed multiple felonies. The detective said firmly, though if she's willing to testify against Chen and provide documentation of their arrangement, the prosecutor might consider a deal. We spent another 2 hours going through evidence, with more revelations emerging from Victoria's desperate attempts to save herself. She'd admitted to 3 more forced property sales we hadn't known about. including an elderly couple who'd owned their home for 40 years, before Victoria's harassment campaign drove them to sell at a massive loss. The scope of her crimes was staggering, affecting dozens of families over the years. By the time I was released that afternoon, news of the scandal had exploded across local media. The parking lot outside the police station was crowded with reporters, all eager for a statement from the man who'd brought down the notorious HOA president. I pushed through them with a simple, no comment. But I couldn't help smiling at their headlines on their tablets. OA President's Reign of Terror Exposed, and Willowbrook Whistleblower Brings Down Corrupt Board. When I finally made it back to Willowbrook Estates, I found a crowd gathered outside the clubhouse. The remaining board members had called an emergency meeting to address the crisis, but it was clear they'd lost all credibility. Angry homeowners demanded answers. Waiving copies of violation notices and fines they now suspected were part of Victoria's schemes. "How many of these fines were legitimate?" shouted James Morrison, the man whose door had been painted the wrong shade of blue. "I paid $3,000 in fines last year alone." "We need a full audit," added Maria Santos, the elderly woman with the garden gnomes. "Every fine, every violation, every forced sale needs to be investigated." I made my way through the crowd, and people began recognizing me from the morning's drama. Instead of anger, I was met with gratitude and apologies. "Mr. Hayes, we should have supported you," one woman said, touching my arm. "We all knew Victoria was out of control, but we were too scared to speak up." "You did what none of us had the courage to do," added another. "Thank you for exposing her." Inside the clubhouse, the remaining board members sat at a table looking shell-shocked. The vice president, a nervous man named Timothy Walsh, was trying to maintain order, but it was clear he was in over his head. When he saw me enter, his face went pale. "Mr. Hayes," he stammered, "I want to assure you that the board had no knowledge of Victoria's illegal activities. We're prepared to void all violations against your property and refund any fines you've paid." "It's not just about me," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Every homeowner who was targeted needs their fines refunded. Every forced sale needs to be investigated, and this board needs to resign immediately to allow for new elections." The crowd erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. Walsh looked like he wanted to object, but the mob mentality was clear. The homeowners wanted blood, or at least accountability, and the current board was guilty by association if not direct involvement. Furthermore, I continued, I motion that all HOA enforcement actions be suspended, pending a complete review of the bylaws and past violations. No more fines, no more harassment, no more selective enforcement until we can ensure it's being done fairly and legally. "You can't make motions," Walsh protested weakly. "You're not a board member." "Then I nominate him," shouted someone from the crowd. Within seconds, dozens of voices joined in nominating me for the board, specifically for Victoria's now vacant president position. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man Victoria had tried to drive out was now being drafted to replace her. "I appreciate the support," I said, raising my hands for quiet. "But first, we need to focus on undoing the damage Victoria has done. I've already been in contact with a law firm that specializes in HOA reform. They're willing to help us audit the past 5 years of enforcement actions and create new bylaws that prevent this kind of abuse from happening again." The meeting continued for hours, with homeowners sharing their own stories of Victoria's harassment. The pattern was clear and disturbing. She'd targeted anyone who questioned her authority, opposed her decisions, or owned property that might be valuable to developers. Minorities and elderly residents had been disproportionately affected, facing more violations and higher fines than other homeowners. By the end of the meeting, the entire board had agreed to resign, and a temporary committee was formed to oversee the HOA until new elections could be held. I was asked to chair the committee, which I accepted with the condition that my first act would be to suspend all enforcement actions and begin the audit process. As I left the clubhouse that evening, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Mr. Hayes?" The voice was smooth, professional, with just a hint of an accent. "This is Marcus Chen. I believe we have some mutual interests to discuss." "Mr. Chen?" I said carefully, aware that this call was probably being recorded by more parties than just me. I don't think we have anything to discuss. Your business arrangement with Victoria Pemberton is a matter for law enforcement now. Come now. He chuckled, though it sounded forced. Surely a man of your intelligence understands that Victoria was merely a tool. The real opportunity here is for smart property owners to maximize their land value. Your grandfather's property, for instance, could be worth 10 times what Victoria offered if developed properly. Not interested, I said firmly. 20 million, he said quickly. Cash. No questions asked. You could retire tomorrow. Live anywhere in the world. All for a piece of land with an old cabin that's seen better days. Mr. Chen. Let me be crystal clear. My grandfather built that cabin with his own hands. It's not for sale at any price. And if you or any of your associates come near my property, you'll find yourself joining Victoria in federal prison. His tone turned cold. You're making a mistake. Mr. Hayes. I'm offering you a fortune for worthless land. This offer won't remain open forever. Good, I said, because neither will your freedom if you keep threatening people. Have a nice evening. Mr. Chen. I hung up and immediately called Detective Chen to report the contact. She wasn't surprised. Marcus Chen was apparently scrambling to salvage his development plans now that his inside person was in custody. But his call had been a mistake. It showed consciousness of guilt and would help build the case against him. Over the next few days, the investigation expanded rapidly. The FBI joined the case, attracted by the interstate nature of Chen Development's operations. They discovered Victoria's scheme in Willowbrook was just one of several similar operations across 3 states. The company would identify desirable properties, then work with corrupt HOA officials or local politicians to force sales through harassment and legal pressure. Victoria, desperate to reduce her sentence, began cooperating fully. She provided documentation showing hundreds of thousands in bribes, detailed records of which properties were targeted and why, and recordings of her own meetings with Chen and his associates. Each revelation brought new charges and identified more victims. The story had gone national by the end of the week. HOA corruption scandal expands dozens of families affected across multiple states, read the Washington Post headline. News crews camped outside Willowbrook Estates, interviewing anyone willing to talk about their experiences with Victoria's regime. I found myself at the center of a media storm I'd never wanted. Reporters called constantly, wanting to interview the hero whistleblower who'd brought down a multi-state corruption ring. I declined most requests. But I did agree to one interview with a local journalist who'd been covering HOA abuse for years. What made you decide to fight back when so many others just gave in, she asked. Sitting across from me on my cabin's porch, I thought about it for a moment, looking out at the land my grandfather had loved. I guess I inherited more than just property from my grandfather. He was a stubborn man who believed in standing up for what's right. When Victoria tried to steal this place through intimidation and lies, I could hear his voice telling me to fight back. Were you ever afraid? She pressed. Victoria had a lot of power and connections. Of course I was afraid, I admitted, but I was more afraid of what would happen if people like her were allowed to operate unchecked. How many more families would lose their homes? How many more people would be bullied into submission? Sometimes fear is just another reason to act. The interview aired that evening, and my phone immediately exploded with messages of support. Other HOA abuse victims reached out with their own stories, and lawyers offered to help them pursue justice. The cabin I'd fought to protect had become a symbol of resistance against HOA tyranny. 3 weeks after Victoria's arrest, I stood in a federal courtroom watching her arraignment. She looked smaller somehow. Her perfect appearance replaced by jail, clothing, and disheveled hair. The confident HOA president who'd stood on my porch demanding I demolish my cabin was gone, replaced by a frightened woman facing 27 federal charges. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically. Extortion, fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, civil rights violations. The list went on. Victoria's lawyer tried to argue for bail, claiming she wasn't a flight risk. But the judge wasn't buying it. Miss Pemberton orchestrated a systematic campaign of harassment against dozens of families, the judge said sternly. She abused a position of trust for personal gain and showed no remorse until caught. Bail is Denit. As they led her away, Victoria looked at me with pure hatred. But there was something else in her eyes too. Disbelief that her empire had crumbled so completely. She'd thought her position made her untouchable, that she could bully anyone who stood in her way. She'd learned too late that even HOA presidents weren't above the law. Marcus Chen's arrest came 2 days later in a coordinated raid across 3 states. The FBI seized records showing the full scope of the property scheme, implicating dozens of co-conspirators. Chen Development's assets were frozen pending investigation, and several other HOA presidents found themselves under scrutiny for similar arrangements. Back in Willowbrook Estates, the community worked to heal from years of division and fear. The new HOA board, elected in a record turnout, implemented sweeping reforms. Enforcement would now require documented warnings and community review before any fines. Board meetings would be recorded and transcribed for transparency, and most importantly, no board member could have any financial interest in property development within or adjacent to the community. I'd reluctantly accepted the position of president, though I made it clear it was temporary. My goal was to help establish better governance and then step aside for someone who actually wanted the job. But for now, the community needed someone they trusted to oversee the reforms. One of my first acts was establishing a restitution fund for Victoria's victims. Working with forensic accountants, we identified over $200,000 in improper fines and fees collected over the years. Every penny would be returned, with interest. For families who'd been forced to sell their homes, we worked with lawyers to explore potential lawsuits against Victoria's assets and Chen Development. The elderly couple who'd lost their home of 40 years were able to use the settlement money to purchase another house in the neighborhood, finally returning to the community they'd been driven from. James Morrison got his door painting fines refunded and used the money to repaint his entire house in whatever colors he wanted. Maria Santos expanded her garden gnome collection out of pure spite, creating an elaborate display that would have given Victoria an aneurysm. 6 months after that chaotic morning when Victoria demanded I demolish my cabin, I sat on the same porch watching the sun set over my grandfather's land. The cabin stood strong, now officially recognized as a historical structure protected from any future HOA interference. I'd added a few modern conveniences but kept its rustic character intact. A car pulled up, and Detective Chen stepped out with a thick folder. "Thought you'd want to know," she said. Joining me on the porch, Victoria Pemberton just agreed to a plea deal. 15 years federal prison, 10 years state, to run concurrently. She'll serve at least 12 before any possibility of parole. And Chen? I asked. Trial starts next month. His lawyers are fighting hard. But with Victoria's testimony and all the documentation, he's looking at 20 to life. The FBI is still unraveling all his operations. You started something big here. Mason. I poured her a cup of coffee from the pot. I kept warm on the porch. I just wanted to keep my grandfather's cabin. Sometimes that's how it starts. She smiled. One person standing up for what's right? By the way, did you hear about the new federal legislation they're considering? The Hayes Act? They're calling it, would limit HOA enforcement powers and require transparency in all board operations. I nearly choked on my coffee. They're naming it after me? Seemed appropriate. You've become something of a folk hero in HOA reform circles. There's even a Wikipedia page about the Willowbrook scandal now. After she left, I sat alone on the porch, thinking about how a simple inheritance had led to exposing a multi-state criminal conspiracy. Grandpa Earl would have been proud. I think he'd always said the cabin would take care of family if family took care of it. He just probably hadn't imagined it would involve taking down corrupt HOA presidents and federal crime rings. My phone buzzed with a text from the new HOA board. They were proposing to rename the community garden in my grandfather's honor. I smiled at that. Earl Hayes Memorial Garden had a nice ring to it. He'd have liked the idea of something growing and alive bearing his name, rather than some cold plaque or statue. As darkness fell, I locked up the cabin and headed to my truck. Tomorrow there would be more HOA business to handle, more reforms to implement, more damage from Victoria's reign to undo, but tonight, I was going to drive into town for a beer and some normal human interaction that didn't involve lawyers, reporters, or federal agents. The cabin would be here when I got back, standing strong just as it had for 60 years. Victoria Pemberton was in federal custody. Marcus Chen would soon join her. And the families they'd victimized were finally getting justice. The 12-hour demolition deadline had passed 6 months ago, and instead of my cabin being bulldozed, it had become a symbol of standing up to corruption and abuse of power. Sometimes the best revenge really is just living well in the home someone tried to steal from you. As I drove away, I saw lights coming on in houses throughout Willowbrook Estates, families settling in for quiet evenings without fear of arbitrary fines or targeted harassment. The revolution was complete, and peace had returned to the neighborhood, all because I'd refused to let a corrupt HOA president force me off my grandfather's land. Grandpa Earl had built more than just a cabin. He'd built a legacy of standing firm against bullies, and that foundation had proved stronger than any HOA violation notice or fake demolition order. The cabin stood, Victoria fell, and justice prevailed. Sometimes that's all you can ask for in this world. The 12 hours she'd given me to demolish my life's inheritance had turned into 12 years or more of federal prison for her. Time has a funny way of balancing the scales when you're patient enough to let justice take its course. And patience, like stubbornness, was another trait I'd inherited from Grandpa Earl, along with 10 acres of land and one very sturdy cabin that no HOA president would ever threaten again. As I pulled into the parking lot of my favorite local bar, my phone buzzed with one final message of the day. It was from Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman whose garden gnomes had been targeted by Victoria. She'd attached a photo of her front yard, now featuring at least 30 new gnomes in various poses, including one that looked suspiciously like Victoria in an orange jumpsuit. Her message read simply, "For Earl?" I laughed out loud in my truck, realizing that my grandfather's legacy extended beyond just the cabin. He'd inspired a whole community to stand up for themselves, to reject bullying disguised as authority, and to find humor in the aftermath of tyranny. The cabin that Victoria had demanded be demolished in 12 hours had instead demolished her entire criminal enterprise, and now it stood as a monument to the simple principle that Grandpa Earl had lived by. Nobody has the right to force you off your own land, no matter what title they give themselves or what fake documents they wave in your face.